Are live. Actually, I am live. I think Josh is dealing with a couple of computer now then while we're talking. So I'm talking to y'all. It's just us right now for the time being. Texas A&M and Ole Miss winding down. It looks like A&M found something at quarterback tonight. At least I think they did. Let me know, y'all, in the comments if you hear any weirdness in the audio, if you can see me, all that. Technical issues are always something that we have. We're going to talk tonight about Ohio State winning against Penn State. It was a weird game, y'all, and we're going to talk about it. Michigan struggling early with Michigan State, which is kind of odd too. But all in all, today was about what we expected, except for that game, that Kansas State-Oklahoma State game. Now, look, Josh and I were not high on either of these two teams in terms of being legitimate contenders. It's one of those things where you got to do a top 10. You got to put somebody in there. We weren't high on them. They were maybe playing a little bit over their heads a little bit, at least in terms of ranking. But in general, I don't think anybody expected what they saw today. Or drive the discussion so far, it's just a lot of arguments about Michigan State in the chat. But I guess for a topic to get us rolling tonight, I want to ask you all in the chat. I'm going to talk about it for a little bit, and we'll probably revisit this before the end of the discussion. But in Kentucky. Now, this game was such a blowout. The matchup wasn't great for Kentucky, but we did expect maybe a little bit more offensive production because, look, we've been on this thing for about 4 weeks now. Not only is Tennessee good, but their run defense is legitimately good. 66% of opponent averages coming into this Kentucky game. Surprised that Will Levis wasn't more successful, and maybe it was because the run game was shut down, but I think we can put the Will Levis first round chatter to bed, because if you can't throw on this Tennessee defense, you've got issues. I think Anthony Richardson has 2 career 200-yard games. One's barely over 200 yards, and one's like 453 on the road in Knoxville. But what I want to ask y'all in the comments, and I'll ask Josh maybe when he shows up, is Tennessee elite or having to some favorable matchups plus Alabama? You know, that Alabama game, they won that fair and square. That's a huge win. Are they elite, or are they going to get exposed next week? I think it's next week, Georgia, Tennessee. I think that's obviously going to come out in the numbers, and we're going to do a preview and all that. But something about this Tennessee team, I just feel like, you know, I've had them at number 4 or better, I think 3 now, for over a month now. And I don't want to upset Tennessee fans out there, but I feel like there's some other shoes going to drop, and they're going to get exposed, because the way I see it right now is they're playing on a like untouchable level, and I think everybody's got warts this year. And so somebody says, why is this even a question? Tennessee is elite regardless of what happens next week. I don't think that's necessarily true. Like, look, I think that they've earned their ranking to this point, and I think that they could be possibly the best team, and that's why I'm asking the question. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they've played all the teams that they need to play for us to know that they can't be exposed. After what we saw with Ohio State today, after what we've seen maybe sometimes offensively with Michigan, you can't tell me that there's not questions around those two teams. There's obviously questions around Alabama and the struggles that they've had this year. Alabama could end up just running away with it, blowing everybody out of the water, or they could lose 2 or 3 games on the stretch. That's kind of what I'm saying about Tennessee. Not necessarily that they're not a top team this year, but like, I'm trying to think of, I don't want to say like the Oklahoma teams, but maybe some of the, like 2017 Clemson. That was a team that I think they were number 1 seed coming into the playoffs, and Alabama beat them with Jalen Hurts. And so that was a situation where we didn't know what we didn't know about Clemson. Here, Josh, big haircut. had some issues. But Josh, I'm asking the crowd right now, is it possible that Tennessee is as good as advertised as we saw tonight in terms of the score? Maybe they've gotten just progressively better since that Pitt game. Or is there a potential that Tennessee just hasn't played the team that has the right makeup in terms of matchups that could expose them, and there still might be a Tennessee that could lose 2 or 3 games this year?
Well, I mean, I think the latter part of it's really the answer to the question in and of itself, right? The question is whether you say that they're legit, right? Are they actually that good? And then we start asking the question of, is it possible that they lose 2 or 3 games, right? Anytime you're asking the question, is it possible that X team could lose 2 games this year? Yeah, I think at that point you have to admit that that team is probably pretty legit. And I think that's where Tennessee is. I mean, they're an elite team on the offensive side of the ball for sure. The thing that was most impressive to me against Kentucky is they showed they were an elite team on the defensive side of the ball. They were attacking,
Right.
They were aggressive. Their pass defense, which has been atrocious all year, again, they've been 100 plus in most categories in that regard. They showed up, and both of us, I think, are of the opinion that Will Levis is not exactly a consistent quarterback. I don't think that's shocking to anybody. But they are somewhat capable, at least. And again, Tennessee's pass defense had been quite bad. Even teams like that have scored. Teams like UT Martin have moved the ball on them at times. That didn't happen. I mean, if they get the kind of defensive performance they had tonight against other teams, it's going to be hard for anybody to win that kind of race with them. Honestly, what they remind me of right now was 2012 Texas A&M, which when they caught fire around the time they beat Alabama, man, you really felt like they would have beaten anyone in that 6-game stretch when they were red hot. I think there's something to be said that Kentucky did slow them down at times in the first half that weren't super crazy explosive in the first quarter. They kind of came on around the second quarter, put a lead on, and then held it. But you could at times hold them in check. But man, I mean, you have to nitpick to say that they're not a top team because they're playing like a top team. They score like a top team. They've got a great run game. They've got a great pass game. And I think the biggest thing they have going for them, as much as people would talk about, Hooker to Hyatt and everything going on the offense, on the offensive and defensive line, they can be dominant at times. I mean, Hooker has forever in the pocket. The run game gets a ton of push. Kentucky is a physical football team, and they still own that line of scrimmage. And then the defensive side of the ball, that D-line has given them great run D stats all year. This year, it showed up in this game, I should say, it showed up in the passing game, right? That they were able to get a lot of pressure on Levis. They made him uncomfortable all night. They created a lot of those turnovers that happened. I think the question for Tennessee is, are they going to drop 1 or 2 games? Are they going to lose to Georgia? And if that's your conversation, are you going to lose to Georgia? Or, just like LSU back in the day, are you going to lose to Alabama? You're in pretty rarefied air. You're a legitimate top 5 team. And that's where Tennessee is right now. At the way they're performing at the moment, they are at that level.
Yeah, I think Tennessee feels a little bit like that 2014 Ohio State team who, they played Alabama at the end of the year and won that game, but those 2 teams were pretty close. It wasn't like the Wisconsin game at the end of the season. Like, they romped a lot of teams. The postseason was a little bit different, or at least the playoffs. Tennessee feels like that team. They just didn't get their loss that Ohio State got to Virginia Tech when they played Pitt. They won in overtime. That's kind of what it feels like to me. Tennessee feels really good right now, and it's not just the clean record, but now they're playing dominant. And I do think that they can be absolutely exposed in the passing game. The issue is they've got an elite offense, and they've got a really, really good, if not elite, run defense. And that might be enough for them to get through. Isaac Adkins says Ryan Day needs to be less involved with the offense. Something just ain't right with all these struggles in the first half of games for multiple years. I disagree with this to an extent. I think that some of the struggles are who they're playing. Like, Penn State is no joke. So struggling on the road at Penn State when you've played nobody all year and you've not had any threats, like any stress on the road, Beaver Stadium, even Big Noon Kickoff, it's not a night game, 110,000 people or whatever screaming their heads off. that takes an adjustment. What I've been encouraged by seeing Ohio State play is the second half adjustments. And that, frankly, is something we haven't seen from like Alabama defensively the last couple of years, is when someone has put in some pressure on you, second half adjustments turn it around. I think that Penn State's just a good defensive football team. I think towards the end of the game, sort of like they did against Michigan, what I thought, if I had one complaint about Ohio State in the first 3 quarters of this game, is it's almost like they looked at the statistics in some defense. Penn State has a really good pass offense, and saw what Michigan did in their run game, and they were trying to emulate that. It's almost like they were trying to prove that they could be a trench warfare kind of team and run the ball at 7 yards a clip and impose their will, instead of doing the thing that they can do, which is throw the daggum ball. Josh, did you get that feeling too, or was it just a matter of them being off today?
Well, a matter of them being off to some degree, but this is really the third time we've seen it at some level. And I can see a lot of people in Stroud and chat talking about, oh no, it's just Ryan Day play calling. And I think that's a little too easy. I mean, play calling for them works great when it works, and it doesn't when it doesn't. Right. I mean, that machine has sputtered. It sputtered for most of the game against Notre Dame. It sputtered for a good half against Iowa. We kept having people come back in the comments in that game and talk about, well, we won by 1 million points. You did. They didn't have a good first half offensively. I mean, they got the ball turned over and over again, and they kept kicking field goals because they weren't really moving the ball. And it was really only late in the game that blew open. And it happened again. I mean, so I said during the Iowa game, and I think both of us had this comment, that there has to be something to that when that happens twice. And their offense, this was something that our model pointed out, even though the score, did eventually, pull away in Ohio State's favor. It didn't love Ohio State to the degree you might think, in part because Ohio State has a tendency to have empty yards. Between the 20s, when you can really run that RPO, when they can really stretch the field vertically, they can move the ball quite well. And I think you saw that today against Penn State for the most part. And the problem is when the field starts compressing, those plays start to go away, and it becomes a lot more about execution. And that's when they start to stall. And Penn State played smart football, which was, try to keep everything in front of you and, just make Ohio State drive the length of the field. But I think the most surprising thing to me in a lot of that game was how much Penn State actually did just come up and challenge Ohio State and sort of dare them to make plays. They were a lot more aggressive with Stroud, and we've seen something we've seen before. Ohio State has such a talented, well-oiled machine that for the most part, they don't get a lot of pressures on Stroud. The receivers are generally open quickly. The run game's usually running well. And when Stroud is able to run that offense in rhythm, they are hard to stop. If you can actually get pressure on Stroud and you can actually make him go through his progressions, he doesn't always operate at the highest level. And he's still a good quarterback in those situations, but he looks a little more mortal, and the offense does slow down. Now let me be clear, that is kind of a complaining about Superman's kryptonite sort of comment. But what I mean by that is that there are things you can do to make Ohio State have trouble. And Penn State managed to do that today for the most part successfully. And there's definitely a huge difference in that offense when they're in rhythm versus when they're not in rhythm. And people can complain about, I'm looking here like the fact that they called bubble screens like crazy and all those things. I mean, those are plays that are designed to force the defense to play you tight. And it's sort of like inside runs. What those plays do is they force the corners to come up and really try to attack you at the line of scrimmage. They keep guys coming downhill. And the idea is if you keep guys coming that way, then eventually you bomb them over the top because you catch guys running the wrong direction and you get behind them. And they just didn't get that done. They didn't protect the quarterback well enough to hit those shots. Some plays, Stroud wasn't on time or accurate downfield. The receivers didn't always make the plays they needed to make. But for whatever the reason, they just didn't execute them. And that's kind of that's kind of the game. So I do think it showed a little bit of mortality from Ohio State, but still at the end of the game, you saw the fact that when they get in rhythm, when things do start moving, all of a sudden they go nuts. If you're attacking and you're being that aggressive as soon as you miss a tackle, and we saw that from Ohio State against Penn State, right? They come up on what was a really short pass to Parker Washington. Two guys crash down on it, they run into each other and fall down, and he scores. Why does he score? Because there's nobody behind him, because they're trying to tackle him at 5 yards. Ohio State is trying to invite that and then get the explosive behind it. And when the explosive isn't coming right now, sometimes I think partly because the running game isn't always that successful, sometimes the offense doesn't really move. So, I mean, that's kind of my takeaway from it. It's not like it's a bad offense. I'm not really dinging it in that regard. I'm just saying that's when they become mortal. And I think honestly, it's a little bit refreshing in a sense, because this is the last point I want to say before I turn it back to you. I don't think Ohio State is a bad offense at all. I mean, they're a top level offense. They operate at a very high level. Their potential is insane. I think a large part of this is just the fact that defenses have figured out ways to disrupt an offense, and they have figured out ways to make you execute at a high level in order to score at a high level. And if you're not on and you're not executing, it's really clear every offense in the country, maybe save Tennessee, and I think even Kentucky, different spurts, we've seen it with them. Everybody in the country can be stopped. Everybody in the country can struggle if you're not executing 100%. The days of 4 years ago where if you had the fastest guys in the field, you were just going to score 40 no matter what, I think those days are kind of gone, and scoring is still higher. Teams can still be explosive, but at least you've got to execute. At least you've got to be in rhythm. Frankly, I think that makes for a more exciting sport. And I don't think anything that went wrong for Ohio State was really a bad thing. I think to a large degree, it's just the fact that Penn State was a little underrated defensively. And I think people have kind of forgotten the reality of what defense is supposed to be in college football, which is that stuff is not supposed to come easy, and you're not supposed to score on every drive.
Stephen Light says another year we can't pull it off against Ohio State. Congrats to them. Only plus is that this is the last year we put Clifford at quarterback. Thank the Lord. Josh, I'm a little surprised. Like, I think coaches have a tough position that they're put in a lot when you have a guy that's been there for a really long time and he's the incumbent. Benching that guy is a gut-wrenching, awfully hard thing to do. It took Nick Saban the entirety of 2017 until they were about to lose a national championship to put Tua in the game when Jalen Hurts wasn't getting it done. And Jalen Hurts has turned out to be a good quarterback, but 2017 Jalen Hurts wasn't really in the same stratosphere as 2017 Tua, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a lot of those examples because coaches tend to ride with that guy out of respect, or just it's too painful to sit a guy who should be a GTA right now. But this one is a situation where, honestly, it's not actual nepotism because, Sean Clifford isn't, but Iowa a lot where you have this incompetence, but you also have this responsibility. You have a responsibility to a Penn State program and all of these fans and all of this money to put the best possible product on the field. And look, Penn State had some drives today. One was that busted tackle that went to Parker Washington, and one was like a couple of them just they manufactured the points that they did. But there was an entire third quarter where Penn State didn't score, and they held Ohio State scoreless. This is another situation, an incompetent quarterback, and survives because even though Ohio State's offense can't get going, the other offense can't either. And he had 4 turnovers today, Josh. 4 turnovers, and I'm trying to understand, like, I didn't see a quarterback today that was really ever in much danger of or threat of beating Ohio State. I didn't feel that way. I don't think you can bench him at some point in this game because of how it went. But we're 6 years into this guy's tenure. It's clear if you want to put the best product on the field, you got to at least try something else at quarterback, don't you?
Yeah, I think long term that's the answer, but I think short term it's often a little too easy to just say play the backup quarterback and everything will be better. Aller in particular, I don't know if we really know if he knows enough of the playbook to play much. When he has played, I haven't felt like he was necessarily that much more effective really than Clifford. He has been at spurts, but not really long-term. I think their problem is that they just don't have a better option. And to some degree, I think that's also the fault of Franklin to not realize where they are, not to consider or not to be able to at least draw in a better transfer quarterback or not to get a high-level quarterback sooner to replace Clifford. There's this problem you end up with when you got a guy that lasts 5 or 6 years that's been the starting guy for that long. You just kind of can't recruit anyone behind him because nobody wants to come in and sit on the bench these days for 2 years. But you also don't really have the ability to run a better option. And it's been obvious that he's been at his ceiling for a few years. I mean, look, when he got to play sandlot football and he's running around and making throws downfield, he was pretty successful. I mean, he made some big plays in that game. And a lot of it was due to his ability to improvise. But when he tries to sit in the pocket and go through progressions, man, he just looks bad. And there are a couple layers to that onion. The first being, it feels like they should do a better job of embracing what he's good at. It reminds me a little bit of last year when Brian Harsin took over at Auburn and they had Bo Nix. They tried to make Bo Nix a pocket passer, and he was terrible. I mean, they almost lost to Georgia State. They ended up benching him for TJ Finley, who's really bad and definitely not as good a player as Bo Nix. It's pretty obvious this year. But it's because in that scheme, trying to be a traditional pocket passer, he was just bad. And then at some point they realized, look, this isn't what he is, and we can't make him that. So let's just let him run around and throw the football. And that's when they, turned it around and shockingly beat Ole Miss, I think it was. That's what you have in Clifford. You have to sort of acknowledge it. And at times I feel like they don't. And when the big problem with Penn State is when they get in crunch time, and I almost feel like when they get in crunch time, Clifford feels like, okay, I got to be a quarterback now. And then everything just goes to crap because he sits in the pocket and he tries to do his reads and he tries to be a pocket passer and he's just frankly bad at it. And a lot of bad things happen, but I just don't think they have a better option. And that's where it kind of gets along to the fact that, as a football team, you're usually defined by the decisions you made 2 years ago, not the decisions you made this year. And everybody wanting to change now, you're way too late. If this stuff needed to happen, there needed to be gears in motion a long time ago. You kind of just have to ride the train that you're on at this point.
Yeah, I will give a little pushback on the Drew Aller. How much does he know of the playbook? Because they only run like 4 plays for Clifton. I mean, it's some version of a wide receiver screen or a dump off somewhere. I know somebody in the chat said, but you got to give Ohio State credit for those 4 turnovers. You do to an extent. And I think it's a little bit of a mixture. Like, I give Ohio State credit for, a tip pass, turnover, a jump in front of a running back, interception. Those they played a part in that. But the first 2 interceptions were because he absolutely locked on and stared a receiver down. The 4th interception was because he absolutely locked on, held up a sign and said, "This is where I'm throwing the ball." The 3rd turnover was I think they had like a 15-yard cushion on all the wide receivers, and instead of taking an 8-yard dump off, he was trying to get a hero shot, and he didn't have the protection for it, and that's why he fumbled the ball. All of that, Ohio State absolutely played a part, but there's a reason why they're putting up 4, 5, 6 turnovers against teams with terrible quarterbacks, and they're not with others, because you don't normally create 4, 5, 6 turnovers in a game. Yeah. It's not because of how he played. I want you to touch on this one, and then we maybe need to move on from this game because we're not doing 2.5-hour shows anymore. Josh, Mike Farino says Day was extremely stubborn today. Middle of the field was open all day, but they kept throwing wide receiver screens for a 1-yard average. 4th quarter was the only one they attacked consistently. Why don't you touch on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to process it. I mean, I think the reality when you see teams doing things like wide receiver screens is they're just trying to get offense going. It's a way to get the ball to your wide receivers and let them try to get yardage. And Ohio State has high-level talent at the wide receiver position. The middle of the field was open, especially late, but it was sort of open because of the way Penn State was dropping guys into coverage. And I think Ohio State, the thing that you usually don't see in those situations is What are they actually trying to do and it's not working? The middle of the field was wide open when it worked. And I think there were times where they started leaving it open and they didn't quite adjust to it fast enough. But I really got the feeling that Ohio State was trying to take some shots. They were trying to take opportunities for explosives. I think Stroud was looking for those opportunities and they weren't coming. And I think from a coaching staff perspective and a quarterback perspective, both, they just weren't really used to being challenged in that way. They weren't used to having those availabilities not open. And you saw the offense get sort of janky because, well, the first read's not there. And now what do we do? And at some point, they kind of made some adjustments and they started to realize, hey, that stuff's not there. Let's start attacking the middle of the field. Let's try to take what's available to us. It's interesting to me because this is the same way that teams have attacked Alabama in recent years, really under Bryce Young. And I think, frankly, it's because Bryce Young is short compared to Stroud. That's a big reason why Stroud might get drafted higher because height matters, and there's a reason for that. But teams are just going to keep trying to take away that deep ball, and it's really easy to get frustrated. And a quarterback that's expecting it to be open sometimes doesn't always bring it down. And then the offensive coordinator feels like, well, we got to keep attacking and it's going to pop someday, and it just doesn't. And again, I think the wide receiver screens were trying to get people to come down so that they could run the offense they want to run. And this also gets into the fact that, just because something is open or available or an adjustment should be made doesn't mean your offense is designed to do it. I mean, Ohio State's offense is not a levels-based. I don't think it's really a levels-based attack. They're not really based off going through progressions and trying to attack the middle of the field on a consistent basis. Yeah, they do hit those plays sometimes, but it's not the primary driver of that offense. And it's hard to just switch that gear over. Your playbook isn't designed for it. You're not used to it from a rhythm perspective. Your chart isn't. And this gets back to something, Daniel, you said at the very beginning, or at least when I hopped on, that it felt like they came into that game thinking it was going to be easier than it was. And it took them a long time to really realize that it wasn't, or why it wasn't working, and to make the adjustment to change. And I will make one more point before we switch over, which is, at the end of the day, these games are defined by players and players making plays. Ohio State continues to, I think, suffer from the fact that, Smith and Jigba is not available. We've been saying, and I will say mostly Daniel, I wasn't 100% on board, but you always made the point that you thought Harrison Jr. was the best wide receiver in college football. I think you're right. Now, I felt like Smith and Jigma was still better. I don't know that I've necessarily been proven wrong because he's been banged up. It may well be that he's better than Harrison. It's just Harrison's that good. They could both be that good. But what I thought was most interesting from this game, which I haven't really seen too many people talk about, you can look at all the stats, all the run stats and everything. This game was dominated by two players. It was dominated by Harrison Jr. and Parker Washington. 185 yards for Harrison Jr. on 10 reception, 179 on 11 receptions for Parker Washington. And it feels like the game of football has turned more and more into a game that is defined by what your receivers can achieve. And in this game, Harrison was, I think, is a better player than Parker Washington. But I thought it was interesting that Washington was as successful as he was. But Penn State outgained Ohio State by 30 yards. They both ran for under 4 yards a carry, 3.8 to 3.4. It was really defined, I think, more by Harrison's consistency, allowing Ohio State to move the sticks, and by the fact that Clifford is just a much more error-prone quarterback than Stroud, and those 3 turnovers were really killer and blew the game open. But it's almost as simple as it was, and I'm not sure what to quite take away from this. I will also say JTT, getting a lot of love in the comments. He had a phenomenal game. I think he had a phenomenal game because he's a great player, and I think it also had a lot to do with the fact that the backup right tackle for Penn State was a tire fire in this game. I mean, the strip sack that he had, the right tackle's turned around backwards and blocking him with his back. And when that happens, you're not just beating the guy. That's you're not using the right technique. I don't think there's any technique where you're supposed to block with your butt. He just got mauled. And that, I think, for all the talk and the battle of Harrison and Washington, I'm going to take one step back and I'll end with that. The thing that decided this game, I think, was JTT being very good, but it was, I think, in equal measure, the right side of that Penn State offensive line was so bad that it created a lot of huge negative plays and kind of broke their offense. And that really shifted the game. Not to say Ohio State wouldn't have won anyway, but it's what caused Ohio State to be able to run away with it, in my opinion.
Benjamin V with the super chat says he can't wait to watch tomorrow. and Benjamin V, I believe, is a Michigan fan. Michigan took care of business today. Here's where I'm struggling with Michigan a little bit. It's the same place I was at last year in that Michigan is not going to win a national championship with a 7-yard per attempt quarterback. And I don't care what anybody says in terms of, like, you can look at how bad they're beating, they're beating Michigan State. I don't take anything negative. I'm not dropping them. They struggled in the first half, whatever. But there's a difference between where you're ranked and winning a national championship. And last year they had a lot of explosive offense where they'd get 2 or 3 touchdowns a game on like a flea flicker or a 4th and 1 that they go for it. They bust through the line and get them. They do it enough that it's part of their offense, that I'm not calling it a fluke. Like, I think it's 2016 Alabama who broke some kind of record for non-offensive touchdowns. At some point, that's baked into who you are as an offense or your scoring. So I'm not discounting it from that standpoint. But a 7-yard per attempt quarterback is not winning a national championship. It might be enough to beat Ohio State again if you have some advantages in the trenches, some advantages defensively, which I think there might be some there. But at what point, Josh, do we see an offense that's a little more dynamic and is not just, hey, we're going to score 32 points every single game, you're going to score 13, and we're going to look good in our like, if you just look at the score at the end of the game, we're going to look good. But how we got there was we had to run for 400 yards. Like, that's the easiest thing to stop. If you're an elite defense, that is the easiest thing to stop in college football or professional football. That's why professional football is a passing game now. Josh, are you a little bit concerned of what you're seeing at quarterback or in the passing game in general at Michigan? If you're thinking of them not as a number 5 team in the country, but as a team that would win a playoff game.
You have to be. You have to be. And the problem I saw in this game against Michigan State, frankly, was the inconsistency was inherent to who J.J. McCarthy was. He's just missing throws. Even when they completed throws, they were generally high or off target. He's not an accurate quarterback. And there are parts where he looks young in terms of his ability to go through progressions and make decisions. He is a very good athlete. He can run the ball well, though he's not big enough to take a lot of punishment. So you end up having to use him as a scrambler. You can't use him as a designed run guy. That's a big difference between KJ Jefferson and a lot of other players. And KJ Jefferson, interesting to me in that Arkansas-Auburn game, there might not be 2 players that are more important to their teams than KJ Jefferson is for Arkansas and Tank Bigsby is for Auburn. And that's because of their versatility in the run game and in the pass game and everything they do. And you can run an offense through them. With McCarthy, he does do a good job of moving the pocket and extending plays, and he has the ability to make throws, but he doesn't make them on a consistent basis. And he's not a big enough, strong enough, athletic enough guy for them to run him on design QB power kind of runs. Like KJ Jefferson will run over a dude. Even Hendon Hooker can hit a guy and carry him. And I think McCarthy's kind of a step back from them from a power perspective. I know athletically he can do really good things for you in the run game, but they just can't run him that much. But my problem is in the passing game, even when guys are open, when the read's there, he doesn't execute it very often. And I've seen this now game in, game out. To some degree, I think the receiving core is a bit of a problem. Ronnie Bell does not look like the guy I was hoping he would be. I don't think he's come back to be quite the same player he was pre-injury, which really makes me sad. I know there's one play he caught in stride, and then he got run down a couple strides later from behind. That's not the Ronnie Bell from a few years ago. And that limits them to a large degree in what they're trying to do. But still, that there's just a limiter in that offense with the way they're run, with the consistency they get from the quarterback position, what McCarthy can and can't do. And I think there's a reason why we're going to get explosive runs and win, or we're not, and we're going to be in a tight game. And it's because that's a good offensive line. It's a pretty good team overall. They're physical. The defense is really good. Every piece of that is an elite team, except the explosiveness in the passing game and consistency in the passing game. It's just not there. And as you said, football is a passing sport at this point. And if that component's not there, it just, that's a restrictor plate going around the Talladega 500. And yeah, it's really concerning for them because I think their ceiling, when you talk playoff discussion, if they had to play Tennessee tomorrow, the way they're playing, I'm right now, frankly, I'm concerned with them with Ohio State. They can't win a real shootout. I don't think the offense is consistent enough to do it against a good defense. And what you just saw from Tennessee is the example of, you can be an elite on offense and you can start clicking defensively. We saw it 2019 LSU. It tends to happen with national title teams. Michigan's not there.
No,
they're just
and
not.
Look, even Tennessee, like that's concerning for me because Tennessee has an elite run defense. Like the way you beat Tennessee, and this is what you're going to come across over the course of a season. The way you beat Tennessee is having a quarterback that can throw for 10 yards an attempt, that can put up 400 yards if he needs to, and can exploit the problems that they have. Running the ball up the middle and hoping that Corum breaks the 60-yarder 3 times a game. That's not how it goes. Brett asks, how is Michigan's offense worse than last year when they road graded Ohio State? Ohio State's defense was a travesty last year. I don't know that, like, comparing year to year is tough in general. Like, I don't love doing that. But Ohio State lost last year because they lost in the trenches and because schematically they were a giant mess on defense. They've fixed a lot of those things. And even still, like, the point is playoff game. And we saw exactly what happened last year when they played Georgia. That was not a contest. That was not a competitive football game because all of the tricks and gadgets that you can do to get 350 yards rushing and beat in Indiana, it doesn't work against elite teams and elite defenses. Ohio State's defense wasn't good last year. So if we're saying that Michigan's offense isn't any worse than last year, okay, you might beat Ohio State. Maybe Ohio State is fool's gold again this year. I don't think they are, but maybe they are. Okay. You're still not beating Georgia. You're not beating Tennessee. You're not beating, if Alabama makes it, you're not beating them. So that's where I was hoping in this offseason we'd see a little bit of change. It is a bye week for LSU, but we got a super chat from Eric, and we didn't talk about LSU last week, even though we had it in the title. So, Josh, we're going to tackle this super chat. I think it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also I'm assuming given the American fleur-de-lis that is an LSU fan, talk LSU, look at the stats. Nobody can score on our defense, and our offense and QB wide receiver now all best in the country after LSU national championship contention. Go LSU. So it has improved considerably, Josh. And I do think their defense is actually, like, there is a point here. Like, Auburn dominated them statistically, but couldn't score any points. But Josh, our offense, QB, wide receiver, now all best in the country. I think some of the offensive production is because they're getting more comfortable in this scheme, but also some of this offensive production might be a little bit because of the teams they played.
Yeah, it's tough to distinguish right now, right? So the last few games, they played Auburn, Tennessee, Florida, and Ole Miss. And Auburn, they were 3.6 yards per play, which is incredibly poor. And anything below 4 yards per play is really anemic in a football game. Tennessee, 4.86 yards per play, which is pretty terrible. It wasn't just that Tennessee bombed on them. They did not move the ball on Tennessee either. Then Florida, they came around and did 7.5 yards per play. And then last week against Ole Miss, they were 6.6 yards per play. The Ole Miss game is kind of interesting because it was 45-20. They kind of ran away with that one, but it was the per play differential, 5.6 to 6.6. What really wasn't that significant. And it was the same way with Florida. It was 6.7 yards per play. Defensively to about 7.5 they gained. That was a closer game, 45-35, but still not that close. The problem with all this is when you look at them in terms of where their yardage is coming from, I think they've been balanced enough, to their credit, that they've been able to exploit what the other team can and can't do. So Florida, they threw the ball for 11 yards per attempt, threw for 350 yards. They didn't, and then Ole Miss still threw it pretty well, about 250 yards passing. Tennessee, they had about 300 yards passing, but the game against Ole Miss, they really ran the ball to success, about 250 yards on the ground. They had almost 200 yards in Florida too, but not at the same clip. I think the problem that teams run into when they're dealing with LSU is that LSU's offense can attack you through the ground and through the air. Daniels is getting a lot more comfortable with his personnel. It's a problem with a transfer quarterback. Hendon Hooker didn't look great for half the year last year either, which we've all kind of forgotten. Same deal with Joe Burrow when he came in at LSU. It seems pretty normal. Transfer quarterbacks take a while to settle in. But now that he's settled in, they've got a lot of balance, and they do have weapons. They've got a lot of depth at receiver. They've got a lot of depth in running back. If you've got a weakness, LSU probably has the player to exploit it on offense. I don't know that their passing game is that crisp. Like Daniel still is a little weird with his reads. He's still not super consistent. I don't know that their offensive line is great. Like if they were in a situation where, well, we kind of saw that right in the Tennessee game, that the whole left side of the offensive line gets hurt and they really had to throw the football because they couldn't run it. They had no answer. They just crumpled. Like if they've got to do one thing and one thing only, and they're one dimensional, I'm not sure how well that's going to translate. But as long as they can keep that balance, as long as you've got a flaw, and everybody they've played has had a flaw, they can do pretty well. And defensively, I think they've shored up. I think they're playing better defense in general. But I will push back there a little bit. I mean, it's only Tennessee was only 3 games ago, right? Ole Miss in the last game, they still gave up over 400 yards. They gave about 400 yards to Florida. The biggest thing with the Ole Miss game is that Ole Miss just didn't finish drives, which we saw even in that A&M game that just wrapped up, right? They had trouble finishing drives. It seems to be a little bit who they are. I think LSU is a good team. I think they're a ranked top 25 quality team, maybe a top 15 quality team. But there's a lot of positives and negatives there. So long answer for a super chat, but we haven't talked about them for a while, so I felt like it was earned.
Yeah, and we will be obviously previewing that game coming up. There's a reason that in spite of all of Alabama's troubles on the road this year, I think they're a 15-point favorite. I think LSU has come a long way. I think that we're going to find out Saturday if either Alabama is going to be in the playoffs or Alabama is maybe who they've shown to be a lot this year in terms of a team that could possibly have a couple of losses. Javari Williams said, good to see you guys. Obligatory go blue. I think we can beat Ohio State again, but further than that, I agree with y'all. JJ has the ability to make throws. He has the strength. He has the precision. He just needs more snaps. I think part of that's true too. Like we talk about him like he's a guy that's a third year in the scheme, but he's not. And he's got a new kind of weird co-offensive coordinator thing going on this year, and is probably scarred from having Gattis as his OC last year, which
I mean, you've got to take a victory lap there, because I don't think there's anyone on the media sphere that was as critical on Gattis as you have been for the last like 3 years. Yeah, and I don't think you were wrong.
No, I think like we see now, like with the
and Lawrence Robinson, Josh, can you give me a Gattis rant? Now I'm punting that to Daniel. This is his lap to take.
So the thing that we said with Gattis from the beginning was, one, I think there's some maturity issues there based on how he left Alabama and based on how he left Michigan. But my initial problem with Gattis was I took the hire of Gattis by Harbaugh as a signal that Harbaugh wanted to keep his hand in the cookie jar. And he's like, okay, I'm going to hire an OC. I'm not going to call plays. Wink, wink. I'm going to hire a guy who has never called plays in his life and was a wide receiver coach to come coach at Michigan. Like, that was my issue. My issue was more with Harbaugh than Gattis there. If I'm Gattis, of course I'm taking that job. Of course, everybody that's a position coach and is young in college football thinks that they can be a coordinator. You don't cut your teeth as a coordinator at the highest level. And he was ruined, in my opinion, in the same way as people ruin freshmen or rookie quarterbacks, in that if you don't get to ease your way into it where you have, like where you don't have huge expectations and you aren't playing, big boy football, as a play caller and you don't learn the things that work in certain situations and you don't organically grow that, then you never get it because you're thrown into the fire in a weird way. I thought Cristobal hiring him in Miami was the dumbest move ever. Anybody that watched that Michigan offense last year saw that they had talented players and a good offensive line, but the scheme was booty. It sucked. The play calling had no feel 2 years in a row. It got a little better that last year, but you had a theory that Gattis wasn't even calling plays by the end of the season. So a lot of people saw this hire as Cristobal stealing him away from Michigan, when in reality, if anybody had paid attention to football the last few years, you don't leave a playoff team that's not named, no offense, Cincinnati or Washington, a brand like Michigan, you don't leave them to go to what has been a crappy program for 15 years now in Miami unless you are asked to leave. So the excitement for him coming into this season in Miami, I did not understand, Josh. And I think that Cristobal's got to make a pretty obvious decision and get a real offensive coordinator down there, because Miami, they can buy a handful of 5-star players here or there, but they're in trouble with their current staff and personnel.
Yeah. They are, as somebody said, it, and it's true, right? Like we were there with everybody else that wasn't really expecting a ton out of Herbert. And when guys go to the pros and they're really successful, I make this point all the time, if guys get drafted higher than you expect based on college production, that's not really a good reflection on your team or your coaching staff. If they think you have a ton of high-level talent and your team wasn't that successful, they're also sort of saying, yeah, you didn't really use these guys right? I mean, that's what they're saying. Like they're saying when they draft Herbert in the middle of the first round, he did not really play like a first-round quarterback that last year in terms of production by any means. They're saying, yeah, you didn't really know how to use this guy. We think maybe you were just wrong. And it turns out that he was even a lot better than they thought, right? And
Josh, is Oregon better this year or last year? This year
right.
without him, or with Cristobal last year?
I mean, they seem to, as the years gone on, with Bo Nix at quarterback, they seem to have gotten substantially better. Yeah, it's none of this is a good reflection on Cristobal as a coach. I had a friend text me, and I turned it into a tweet because I just thought it was so funny. It's like, Miami is an NFT, like as a football team, that they're an NFT. It's just sort of a made up hologram sticker that's throwing a lot of money around, and we're supposed to be told that it's this great thing and that it could boom into something bigger. But it's not there. It's fool's gold. It doesn't seem real. I think if they keep acquiring talent like they're acquiring, they're going to have to be pretty good. Like it's almost inevitable. There's no way you can be in the ACC and have a ton of 5-star talent and not be better than other teams. Just because the ACC is not that talented to where you can't differentiate yourself. But man, yeah, and given what they had in the quarterback position, the fact that Van Dyke's a pretty good player and they seem to have ruined him, I don't know. I think they're going to make changes. I can't think. I'd be surprised, honestly, if Gattis is retained for a second year, and maybe if Cristobal can go back to being more of a hype man, and he can get some offensive and defensive coordinators to just kind of run the show, that ship can turn pretty quickly. Because I mean, that's what happened at LSU for years, right? They had great coordinators. I truly believe that Les Miles was kind of a lunatic, frankly. But he had a phenomenal defensive coordinator in Aranda that gave him a ton of consistency. And Orgeron was who he was. He was an absolute hype man. But when he had good coordinators, they could be really good. And I think that's what you're going to get from Miami and Cristobal. And unfortunately for them, Gattis is absolutely not a high-level coordinator that knows not only play calling right, but just knowing how to run practice and set up a scheme and all that kind of stuff. The organizational stuff that is 60% of what makes a team good. He's just way, way behind. Let me touch on a super chat before we move on. Just Javari Williams talked about, again, with JJ McCarthy, best case is there's a little left in the tank as far as play call and pass game, but there's a reason you see near zero deep balls called. He lacks touch and he's not seeing the whole field. And he said, again, good job on Gattis. That's sort of your segue. But yeah, I mean, to wrap that up with McCarthy, I think he can get there with his mechanics downfield. I know he leads the country in completion percentage, so people say I'm crazy to say that he's kind of inconsistent, but they call that game. Like, I think Williams is 100% right. They don't call a lot of deep balls. They call that game knowing what he can and can't do. And Michigan is so good as a football team otherwise, they can afford to do that. They can afford to let him be the highest completion percentage quarterback in football by just letting him do what he does well over and over again. But there's a limit to how far you can go with that approach. And yeah, I think, week by week, we're going to kind of see that show up. And I'll note, I don't think he's going to be the highest completion percentage quarterback next week. I think the 15-25 game, I'm not sure how tight it is that he may fall, but, that he had a pretty average game for a starting quarterback of a good football team this week. So I don't think he's going to hold that line.
Josh, Uncle Rico asked, and maybe he was trying to segue us into our top 10s. So that's your cue to get ready and get your top 10 going. Thoughts on Clemson's marquee wins being killed by Notre Dame and Louisville today? They aren't one of the 4 best teams. Uncle Rico, you're right. And Josh, are you ready for me to do my top 10?
I got one team to figure out. So yeah, go with your top 10 and
it's funny
because done.
I've got 2 teams to figure out because this top 10, I honestly want to stop at 8. It's awful. Like,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. Guys in the chat. So this is your challenge as we're going right now. And I think people have gotten a little nicer to each other, that there's, game days here going back and forth, but I'm telling you right now in the chat, do a top 10. And I mean 10.
Yeah.
Try to figure out 8, 9, 10. It ain't
this
fun.
Will get cut up. This is going to get cut up into a top 10, and we give y'all homework all the time. Y'all are going to call us crazy. Off the jump, you're going to call me crazy. Give me your top 10 and tell me why we don't know what we're talking about, because I'll tell you, we don't. Nobody is looking at the teams in the college football right now and says, oh, I can give you 10 teams. The problem I have right now, Josh, is we're getting into this like resume versus quality range of not knowing what to do, and that's really messing with me. And one of mine, number 9, is what's gonna make people laugh at me, but I'm gonna do it anyway. All right, top 10. Number 1, Josh, I've got Tennessee. I have Tennessee right now because they have the best win in the country, and they've been absolutely dominant outside of that Pitt game. And Ohio State fans are going to say, well, wait, we've been dominant. We dominated Penn State today, and that one's not good. But we've already talked about 2014 Ohio State. And I think that Tennessee is in that realm, in that 2014 Ohio State was so much better in week 9 than they were in week 1. And I think that Tennessee right now, in addition to having the best win in the country, is also absolutely dominant. And I think that they've earned it. And I am fully admitting that they might lose to Georgia Saturday. But this week, right now, I've got Tennessee number 1, and it's a combination of ranking and earning. Tennessee has had a tougher schedule than Ohio State. And I don't think Kentucky's great. I don't want Big Ten fans get at me. I don't think Kentucky's great at all. I don't think there's, just like I've been giving Penn State credit all year for beating the brakes off of Auburn. Auburn's a bad team, but beating them that bad is impressive. I do want to see Tennessee beat somebody away from home. That's of note. Number 2 is Ohio State. I'm not really punishing them for today at all. I still think that they're the best team in the Big Ten. I was a little concerned for 2.5 quarters, but they also handle their business. I mean, I said that was going to be a 10-point game, I think, and I said that I wouldn't look poorly on them if they won that by 1 point, because it's a tough place to play, and I think Penn State is better than people are giving them credit. And I think in a loss, until the last kind of 6 minutes of that game, even in a loss, I might have Penn State in my top 10. I think they'll be a little deflated at this point to say they're number 10 in the top 10. Number 3 is Georgia. They were dominant today as well. I think Anthony Richardson getting hurt early had a little bit of impact on what that Florida offense could do. I said Florida finds a way to get 20 points. They did that. But Stetson Bennett getting it done, man. This offense getting it done. We'll see when they play Tennessee if they can keep up. Alabama, number 4, ahead of Michigan, number 5. If Alabama played Michigan today, I think that Alabama would win. I don't think that Michigan would be undefeated with Alabama's schedule because I don't think Michigan could beat Tennessee on the road at Tennessee. We talked about that earlier, and I think it's because there are some teams in this top 5, top 10 that Michigan could beat, but Tennessee has a very, very, very good run defense and obviously a great offense. I think they would stress Michigan in the same way they stressed Alabama. Number 6, I have Oregon. Oregon has been dominant, and I really struggle with Oregon in that I can't forget that first game of the year. I just can't. But I also think that they're a different team at this point in the season. They did have to do everything they could to beat Washington State. Let's not forget that. Like, they were trailing that entire game until the very end. But also say everybody has warts this year, including number 7, Clemson, which gets us to Uncle Rico's Super Chat. We've got more information with Clemson. That's the thing that I want people to really understand with them, in that last week that we told everybody, pump the brakes on Syracuse as a ranked win. Pump the brakes on that being a big win. Syracuse isn't a good football team. They got beat soundly today by a mediocre Notre Dame team. Wake Forest had 6 turnovers in 1 quarter, which I think is a record. Lost to a bad football team. So these wins that Clemson's hanging their hat on to be in the top 4, top 5, Wake Forest and Syracuse, don't look great. And then who else have they beat? NC State sucks this year. And even when they had Leary. I've got TCU at number 8. I've bumped them down 1 spot. That defense concerns me. I think if we're talking about them being ranked where they in the top 10 because they have a clean record, I will agree. But that defense is going to get them in trouble at some point in the year. But I do love what they've done offensively. Here's where I make everybody mad, Josh, if I haven't already. Number 9, I've got LSU. Kind of back to the point we were talking about earlier where they've gotten better throughout the year. I've got LSU at number 9, and this is less about resume and more about would I want to play LSU tomorrow? Gun to my head, do I think LSU might beat Clemson? Maybe. I think they might. Do I think they might beat the team that I have number 10 in USC? I think they would. Number 10, USC, I'm struggling putting them in the top 10 at all. They have a clean record, but with a loss. They lost last week to Utah. They have a clean-ish record, but they barely beat Oregon State. They barely beat Arizona. And my question is, if USC was playing in the Big 12 or the Big 10, would they still be 6-1? Or are we giving them credit, too much credit, for having a schedule that is just not good? And I've got them in there because who else do I put Penn State in there with a loss today? Do I put UCLA in there after getting worked last week? It's so hard, guys. It's really hard. I've got 10 USC there, but I don't think I think that there's a lot of teams 11 to 30 that would beat USC, but for now I got to give that clean record a little bit of credit. Josh, give me your top 10. Let's see how you do.
Yeah, it's tough, and it's tough at the top and it's tough at the bottom. My number 1 team remains Ohio State. I still think they're the most complete team. Defensively, they're very good. Offensively, they continue to scare me a little bit at times, but when they're in rhythm and they're working, they're great. It's really obvious now that playing on the road matters again for some reason in college football. That was a tough environment. And they did sort of sleepwalk offensively for the second time this year for the majority of a game. But when they came on, and their weapons are better than anyone else's. But again, the defensive side of the ball was what really stood out. And if they have that kind of balance, I don't know that anyone else really matches it in terms of explosive potential on offense and good defense. Nobody else is really there. My number 2 team is Tennessee. They're offensively, they are the best team in the country right now. The way they're playing today, they are the best offensive football team in the country. And somebody's saying like, you can look at statistics in Georgia or Ohio State. I don't really care what statistics you want to throw out there. Ohio State or Georgia, neither one of them are moving the ball with anywhere near the same consistency. Tennessee can run the ball very successfully. They can throw the ball very successfully, and they're doing it against pretty darn good defenses and at times making it look kind of easy. They remind me a lot of 2012 Texas A&M, maybe 2019 LSU. Like there aren't that many teams that move the ball that easy as an offense. They're not built the same way 19 LSU is, which is why I say the A&M team, a little more quarterback driven, a little more explosive, razzle dazzle. 2019 LSU could just sort of work the field and just, beat you at every position doing whatever they wanted to do just due to their star talent and quarterback play. And I'm not sure LSU is quite the same machine, or Tennessee is, but that LSU team was, but they're still good enough to be my number 2. My number 3 is Georgia. I mean, they're still a very good football team. Georgia's, I think, handled Florida pretty well. Now that was a 1-score game in the fourth quarter before they kind of stepped on Florida and put them away. But I think that shows the problem with Georgia. They're offensively, when you really challenge them, you can really kind of see that offense start to creak. And they've got the best tight end room in the country, but as I've always maintained, you can't consistently maintain high scoring through a tight end room. I mean, they make phenomenal plays, but they don't turn into 80-yard touchdowns play after play. And they do a couple times. That Bowers catch was great, and catch and run, but it kind of depends on the DB falling down, right? I mean, you can't do that on a consistent enough basis to put up the kind of game like Harrison just did against Penn State. And that's kind of the limiter for Georgia. I think defensively they're very good. But it was really obvious when Anthony Richardson hurt his leg in this game today, it just broke Florida offensively. He's not a good passer. And if he can't run, then you get the numbers advantage. And when they started running him in the second half and they got the numbers from that, all of a sudden Florida looked like the run team that they went into this game as statistically. And they did move the ball on Georgia quite a bit. So that, again, it kind of gave me a little bit of pause. I think Georgia is a very, very good team. I don't think they're as good a team as they were last year. I'm not sure if that's good enough to win a title or not, but that's kind of where they are. My number 4 team is Michigan. I think Michigan didn't really impress me that much against Michigan State. That was a slow burn against a not very good team. I've seen them be too inconsistent on offense too many times now. When they get explosives in the run game, they can be great, but that is also something that can be taken away from you. And so, yeah, I think defensively they're a very good defense. I'm not sure that they're as good as they were last year in certain ways. I think they're more consistent and complete, but they're not as splashy. And they're just, I think there's a limit of what they are offensively and defensively. And if they face a truly elite unit that's clicking on either side of the ball, I think they probably would get exposed a little bit. And, when you're talking top 4, top 5 rankings, we're in that kind of a discussion. They're going to beat most teams. They're going to beat them most pretty badly. But Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio State, Alabama are different animals. And that's leads into my number 5, which is still Alabama. Alabama, with that loss, has to be lower out of the top 4. I'll be honest, if they were to play right now, I don't know that I would pick Michigan to beat Alabama. And I don't know where Alabama is going to be. They've been really weird because Bryce Young's been hurt for a few weeks, and that really affected them offensively. And then defensively, they started really great and almost elite, got exposed by Tennessee. But this is a big point that really hits me in mind for 2 teams. One, Alabama, one you discussed, Daniel, and that's LSU. Getting exposed by Tennessee may not be that bad of an indictment. It may be that Tennessee is in that elite offense tier that we talk about all the time where those teams are just going to score 40 plus every game. They might be the one team that's really doing that. And if that's the case, now I do think Alabama had a lot of issues in that game, but I think they kind of got shell-shocked, and that might not be the indictment we think it is. And otherwise, I haven't seen them put together a good game offensively and defensively but they've looked as good as anyone offensively, and they've looked as good as anyone defensively at different points. If they put it together, I still am on the page with Josh Pate to say their potential is to be the best team in the country because their defensive potential is higher than even Ohio State's, for example. And their offense isn't as loaded as Ohio State, but I think their defense has the potential to be that much better than Ohio State's, where they can play on that same tier. But they haven't put it together, and so they have to stay down there at number 5. My number 6 is Clemson, and this is where we start sort of getting into, default rankings. I am not that high on Clemson. I completely agree with Daniel that I am really concerned that they're a mirage due to their schedule. I was never very high on Wake Forest. I've watched them some this year. I don't think they're a great football team. I think their defense is poor. NC State, I think, is a way worse football team than people thought they were going to be going into the year. I don't know why, but they're just not as good, particularly defensively. I think Clemson, I think, is a beneficiary of their schedule, but they still have a ton of talent. They're running the ball better. They're still good defensively. And at this point, the pickings start getting a little worse. TCU is my next one up. They're number 7. I don't love TCU's defense, and they managed to put away West Virginia, but that's a bad West Virginia team, and they didn't look that much better for a lot of that football game. I don't think TCU is going to keep their record. I think they're going to lose one or more games through the remainder of the year. I frankly think they're probably going to end up in my top 10, but they're there right now. And I've said this before. I'm not very high on the Big 12 this year. I was not high on Oklahoma State. I kept not wanting to put them in my top 10. And eventually, this week they kind of showed why maybe they shouldn't have been in my top 10 as they took a loss. Next up for me, number 8 is Oregon. They've been playing great football. Again, the Big 12 and the Pac-12, I'm sketchy on. It's easy to rag on the ACC. We forget how isolated every conference is, and my eyes just tell me the Pac-12 is not playing good football. That's just my impression. There aren't a lot of statistics to really match it up, but it's really the same things Daniel said. When you start to break down what a lot of the other teams in the Pac-12 did, the fact that USC lost to Utah and Utah lost to Florida, and Florida is a bad football team by SEC standards, makes it hard for me to really want to put USC in there. I mean, the fact that USC didn't look great week after week against teams that I think are really kind of a second tier for what would be in the Big 10 or SEC alarms me, but I can't put them any lower given their record. And my number 10 is LSU. So you're not so crazy, Daniel, or at least not in my mind. When you get past 8, there are not any really good picks here. And here's the thing with LSU. They've got 2 losses. One was a blowout to Tennessee. That was a game where their starting left tackle and left guard were lost that morning. The left tackle got ill, and then the left guard ends up getting hurt in the first quarter, and the left side of their offensive line collapsed, and then they got blown out by Tennessee, in part because their offense when you lose the whole left side of the offensive line and you're just giving up pressure play after play, your offense goes in the tank, and that's what that game was. The problem with me with LSU, right now, I think they're a top 15 quality team. That Florida State loss is bad. And we always talk about it's how you did with your schedule versus how somebody else would do with your schedule. And my problem with LSU is they're a higher quality team, maybe, than they are a ranking team. Because, you've got to ding them for that FSU loss. And so, yeah, I kind of got them in 10, but I also understand why, the AP may not want to rank them higher. The problem, though, when you start looking at the rest of the rankings, right, who else do you want to put in there? Like Ole Miss is one to consider with their 1 loss. But remember, LSU blew out Ole Miss, right? So that's why I have really LSU in the spot they're in. I don't think it can be Utah, given the discussion we just had. I don't think it can be NC State. I don't really buy Illinois. I know they won by a good margin today, but against an awful Nebraska team, I think Illinois is just a product of their schedule. Same deal with UCLA. I think UCLA is a product of their schedule. It's tough. I think the MASH, they've been saying all year, the gap between like 8 and 30 is really slim. I think it's 100% true. I think all these teams in that group, a lot of them are going to take more losses. I think anybody really out of the top 6 is probably, it may well be that no one finishes. There may be something like 5 teams in the country that finish with less than 2 losses. Maybe only could be even 3 or 4. And I do think this is one of those years where we're probably going to have top 3 lost teams in the top 10, just because it seems like this middle tier is destined to beat itself up because it's so competitive in those conferences. But yeah, that's my top 10. And if you think it's easy, good luck trying to do it, because I think after 8, man, it's a mess. If you want to rank based on quality, if you want to rank based on resume, you're going to swap it up a ton, because the difference between number 9 and number 20 isn't that high. And depending on how you want to do your rankings, you're going to end up with a pretty different list each time.
Yeah, and some people are going to say, put Ole Miss in there. They got a pretty clean record, but they lost like last week to a team that we've got in the top 10. They also played a true freshman quarterback tonight and could have lost that game against an A&M team that, like, look, A&M played Alabama close. A&M has a lot of talent, but A&M played Alabama's backup quarterback close and still lost, even though they turned the ball over like 5 times. I don't think A&M's a great football team. I did what I saw from the freshmen tonight, and I wonder, Josh, we're talking about Penn State earlier, and not making a decision to go to Drew Aller. Is there a little bit of indictment on Jimbo for not going to what I thought decisive quarterback, spun the ball very well, made really good reads? The offense looked functional, and yes, it's against Ole Miss, but like, are you telling me that App State, who give up 63 to North Carolina, is a much better defense than Ole Miss? Like, I thought that Wegman looked a lot better than anything else they've had. Is that kind of an indictment on Jimbo too for not playing him sooner?
I think it has to be at some level, right? One of the main responsibilities of a coach is to figure out what your best personnel is to put on the field to form a team. Coaches don't play football. Coaches coach football, and coaches assemble a roster. And if you can't identify what your best roster is, then I think you have a problem. Now, I will say I'm always really hesitant when you talk freshman quarterbacks, because, again, you don't like, it may be that 4 weeks ago that Connor Wegman wasn't really capable of starting a football game. And it may be that they know they can only get so many games out of him before they're going to show the entire Connor Wegman playbook. And we see this a lot. Like last year with Caleb Williams, we bring this example up all the time. He looked great for like 2 games. And then people saw, okay, this is what he is, and these are the plays he runs. And he sucked for the rest of the year. And it wasn't because he was a bad quarterback. It's because he didn't know enough of the offense to be able to do a whole lot more. And you can shut a guy down in that situation. So I'm a little forgiving with the true freshman situation. But I will say, and I've said it, the beginning of the year, I took heat for this, right? But my amateur eye looked at Haynes King and said, there's no way this guy's going to be a good quarterback. And they started him. And I don't know, if I don't know what A&M thought they were ever going to get out of the offense starting Haynes King. And eventually they made the switch to Max Johnson, right? And maybe this is the more of an indictment. And Max Johnson looked a lot better than King did. And he wasn't good, but they were functional offensively with Johnson. And it was only because he got hurt that they had to go back to King, and he was terrible again. So now they went back to Wegman. And again, he's not great, but he's functional. So, yeah, I mean, it's not just one guy, it's 2. Like, they made the point to start Haynes King. Like, Fisher forced that. And at no point has he been good. And I don't know who saw anything or what they saw to make them think that this was a sensible move, but it did not work. And I've always felt like it's not a good sign for a coaching staff when they improve due to some injury forcing you to play a guy you didn't want to play that ends up being a lot better, or you discover a guy is better midway through the year. I mean, that's an indictment on your ability to evaluate your own team. And I'm going to wrap in, sort of segueing in, Mike Farino's super chat where he says, I know this is late, but is Notre Dame the most bipolar team in the U.S.? Seem to play great versus good teams and horrendous to really bad ones. I mean, Notre Dame's a team, right, that has had to switch quarterbacks off and on, and they found some success by sort of inadvertently switching to a quarterback that ended up being a lot more successful to them. I think that's an indictment on the coaching staff. Now, we already said we think we don't think Syracuse is actually a good team, which I think is a lot of it. But I think that's a piece, right? And I will give a couple more that are maybe interesting ones people haven't thought about. Tennessee looks awesome this year. That offensive scheme is working really well. Do we want to have a conversation about the fact that Heupel didn't start Hendon Hooker last year? That he started Joe Milton? We all kind of forget that it took a long time for him to realize that he needed to start Hooker. I gotta be honest. There's a big piece of me that thinks I think Heupel has a really good scheme. I do. I think they may have lucked into that roster a little bit. I mean, Brew McCoy is a transfer. They've got a lot of transfers on the offensive side. They took Hooker and they didn't even expect him to start.
Yeah, they're real senior too.
They started a different, they started a different transfer over him. So while I give them credit for building what they have and having the scheme, I think you got to take a step back and realize they didn't know what they were building at Tennessee last year. And they lost some games they should not have lost. Like, I think Pitt they lost to last year, that if they had started Hooker, they would have won. And they got a great team now, but it's interesting around the sport of college football that transfers are available. We talked about Penn State, right? Penn State probably should have realized 2 years ago that they needed a better solution at the quarterback position, and they didn't manage it. They let Will Levis go. And I don't know if Will Levis is the greatest QB ever, but he certainly looks like he probably has a higher ceiling than Clifford, and somehow they never got that out of him. So that does seem to be a bit of an epidemic in football, not understanding who your starting quarterback is, not making the correct evaluation. I don't know if it's loyalty, development, or what, but I think you can say a lot of things about that. And I know Mike Farino give one more, trying to make sure to stay on top of super chats, but he said Hooker has said in interviews he really struggled early with the playbook, and I'm sure that's true. But at the same time, Milton was terrible. If you watch Tennessee,
he was bad at Michigan too.
I mean, he was so bad. And then Kendall Hurley said Connor Wegman and Drew Aller at Penn State should have started last week, if you ask me. Fisher and Franklin are overrated. And that's, I mean, you can have this conversation all around who should be the starting quarterbacks, right? And I think a lot of it, frankly, is justified.
Yeah, Horatio says Tennessee won't be anywhere near this good next season. Now, I think that Heupel's system is good enough to generate points, enough that they'll be relevant. And this is what I've always said, and this is where Auburn screwed up. A lot of these schools screwed up. When you are at a huge talent disadvantage, you have to hire a guy who has an elite system that can neutralize that gap. Because Tennessee is not as talented as the team. Like, they're not more talented than Alabama. It allows you to kind of skip 2 steps ahead from where you would be as a program. And then because you've gotten wins, maybe a little artificially, because you've brought a system to the table that's kind of schemed your way into some wins, then you build some recruiting momentum. Tennessee's going to build recruiting momentum out of this. You can't just get an all-arounder anymore to come in and dig a team out of a hole that plays good competition. You can get an all-arounder to win at Alabama, to win at Ohio State. You've got to have someone who has an elite system. And that's what USC did. Like, they tried to hire a guy that would bring them a lot of points, right? Not just somebody that's going to preach tough-nosed football. And that's why I think Bielema didn't work at Arkansas ultimately. So I'm a little concerned about Sam Pittman at Arkansas, although I do think he brought in some good offensive chops to help that side of the ball. I think that's where you are with Heupel. But I will say, with Tennessee, that is a very senior-laden team. That is a team that's going to get absolutely wrecked in the draft and graduations at the end of this year. It'll be interesting to see them rebuild, but they're going to be in a lot better position to get some recruiting wins because they've had the year that they've had. Josh, I know we're getting towards the end, and you're probably getting sleepy. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll say Tennessee. 14 of 15 leading tacklers on the Tennessee team are draft eligible.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think Heupel's a good coach, and I think they're building something. But to your point, right, they brought in a great system that allowed them to jump a couple steps ahead, and really, I think, take advantage of the fact that they had a nice collection of pieces they leveraged the transfer portal really well. Some of that, like I think Hooker was actually brought in by Pruitt originally, but they leveraged all that and the fact that they had a good position, but they were able to leverage it due to the system. And then the question is, and someone did the same thing at Texas A&M, right? The question is, can you do all that and take the next step by turning that into good recruiting and then developing that recruiting and then sustaining it? But you know, they're checking the first box, and I'm not saying they won't check the others. I'm just saying there's a lot of boxes on the sheet.
I'll end with this because we always like a little NIL rant. Somebody, and somebody's asked about the Michigan State tunnel issue. We don't know that started or that came about after we went live. So in the comments, I think there was a pretty big, I think got pretty nasty. Somebody up the line said something about you know, talking about it came out of your conversation or your comments about starting Joe Milton over Hooker, but the pressure, because this is relevant to Tennessee, they've got a high-priced NIL quarterback coming in, and that's another thing that NIL, I think, will do to the college game, that big dollar first round, and especially in the era of visibility and everything in the NFL, there's a lot of pressure to start first round picks. And I think that NIL is going to change the game in a way where you pay a lot of money for these kids to come and play for you. The expectation from the boosters or the businesses that are putting money into these true freshmen, 18-year-olds, is they want to see them on the field. So that means that you are actually, in some ways, potentially hurting or putting a poorer product on the field because of the pressure to start these guys. And that's something that nobody's talking about with NIL. But at Miami and really in the skill position world, we're going to see this be a problem, I think, in the next couple of years.
Yeah, there's a lot of additional pressures that people probably haven't thought through. Things like your big time boosters that may well be on your board of trustees are going to funnel big time money to get a player in your team. And they do it for NIL. And as part of that, they have to do some sort of endorsement thing, you know, whether it's fake or not is kind of a secondary question. But let's say they bring in a freshman quarterback and then the board member helps give him money for an NIL deal to go do advertisements for all his car dealerships. You think he's going to be happy if you don't start him? Do you think the player is going to be, you know, really thrilled if he's not playing? Do you think the backup guy doesn't have the car dealership is going to be thrilled when you start the dude that has it? Like the dynamics from here are really dangerous. And another thing I've heard, because the NCAA just released a new set of guidance actually to the colleges, which I found pretty interesting last week. And the guidance made really clear that the colleges can't have any interaction with establishing the NIL deals. They felt like it was really becoming a problem, I guess, that the colleges seemed to have a hand in it. And there are a couple schools that have sort of rebuilt their NIL around the college having more of a hand in organizing it. And they've done stuff about like trying to educate people on how to do NIL. And they also came forward and said, look, you can't be doing any of that. You can give them financial literacy training. You can make sure they have some counseling options, but you can't be telling them how to do NIL. You can't be helping them get in touch with agencies and stuff. That's the way a lot of it's built right now. Once that goes away, the problem you're going to have, though, is who tells the collectives who you want to be recruiting, right? If you've got a 4-star in your state and you go, man, this kid's kind of toxic, and there's this other lower ranked kid, you know, I'm a Texas school, right? And we've got this number 40 ranked overall quarterback. Well, I really want the number 60 ranked guy out of Louisiana because he's a better kid than this kid in Texas. I think he's a better fit for my system. What happens when your board of trustee member sort of lines up a deal where this Texas kid is going to get $4 million to go to Texas and he wants to commit? Do you have to take him? And when you take him, are you stuck with him? Do you have to start him? There's a lot of wrinkles here, a lot of complexities. And I think people need to bear in mind, there's a lot of politics at a lot of these colleges, and these coaches are serving the whim of ADs, and the ADs are totally at the whim of the boosters. And, we've heard for years that at Texas, they have a problem where the boosters want to meddle and they want to tell people who should be starting or how the team should be run or who they should hire as an assistant. You think that's a problem now? Imagine how bad it's going to be when those boosters are the ones that are actually playing for the players to be there. I think it can get to an entirely higher level. And I think we've only begun to see what this Pandora's box is going to bring.
Yeah. And I'll kind of end on that. Like we've already seen it. I think a Miami, in a little different way, a Miami basketball player last year had a good season, was threatening to sit out if he didn't get a better NIL deal. Like, this is a Pandora's box and it's crazy, but I don't think anybody's thought about the pressure that it's going to put on coaches to play guys, because think about like the intertwining of boosters here, because they're boosters. Like, if you've got a big car dealership in a college town and you've been basically paying a coach's salary or his raises or whatever, because not all that comes from like direct school money, you're paying that coach's salary effectively. And now you're paying the 18-year-old kid quarterback's salary as well. You're going to want to see him on the field, because if it is really about getting a return on your investment and not just about paying players, man, you're going to want to see that guy succeed, because you're going to succeed. And these are things that nobody has thought about. Josh, we got to end it. It's really late. I'll let you have a parting shot on this thought. Georgia came out an 11-point favorite opening line against Tennessee Saturday. Give us a parting shot on that, and I'll close this up.
Surprising. I would not have guessed the line would be that high. That's surprising. I'm going to have to sort of break it down a little bit. But, yeah, that's going to be one of the tougher games to pick. And I will say this too, and this is an interesting thing to me. We have not seen Georgia play an opposing offense that is as good as Tennessee, maybe under Kirby Smart's entire tenure. Am I wrong on that in the regular season?
In the regular season, no. I would say,
well, maybe
Alabama's offense.
2020 Alabama, yeah, and they got kind of torn through. But that was also the year that Georgia wasn't that great in general. So I don't think that really was taken as much. But this is, I think, I would almost say by far the toughest regular season offensive challenge that Kirby Smart has faced with a good team. And it's interesting because a lot of the discussion in the next week is going to be centered around things like second half of the Alabama game where they lost in the national title, or the Alabama game in the SEC championship last year, right? Are they going to be able to show up and show out versus a top level offense? You took Rose Bowl versus Oklahoma. And what Vegas seems to be saying is they think they can, or they think that they have the ability to maybe bully Tennessee or outscore Tennessee. Probably says a lot about the way people view Kentucky. Kentucky, man, they can play pretty bad football this year. And a lot of it has to do with Levis's inconsistency. And you did get bad Levis. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to mull on for me. Cause I heard that live. And I don't think I'm ever going to be comfortable making this pick, but it's a lot for me to mull on going into tomorrow.
And y'all, that's just a segue to let you know that we're going to be doing that preview this week. So keep an eye out for that one coming Monday morning. Check that one out. Thanks so much, y'all, for coming late night tonight. But we had a lot of people on tonight. It was a great live show. Great in the comments. Avoided some of the usual toxicity we had out there. Thanks so much, y'all, for staying with us this late. Look for our previews this week. Y'all have a great week.